at the topic today and excited at the interest in 2022 in these. As a reminder, all past webinars, or almost all of them, are archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website. So go and have a look at things there and watch to your heart's content. And so this week, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amy Toth. That's a professor in Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology. And I think I got the department right there. So work with Dr. Crumpton a lot, and so I've had to say that department name many times over the years. So Dr. Toth is going to talk today about can prairie habitat in the farm-dominated landscape of Iowa benefit bees and beekeepers. So a topic, the prairie and prairie strips, near and dear to my heart, and really exciting the work that's being done by Dr. Toth and others on whether these prairie habitats can serve as beneficial areas for bees and beekeepers. With that, you didn't log on to hear me talk, so turn it over to you, Dr. Toth.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. So I just first wanted to introduce myself. Matt did a great job, but just to give you my contact info in case you are interested to talk more after today's webinar. This is my laboratory website. It's tothlab.org. You can also reach me by email. I'm also on Twitter, and I am in the EEOB department as well as the entomology department at Iowa State. So what I'd like to do today is talk about bees. And I'm sure some of you are already familiar with bees, but I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a plug for why we should care about bees in the first place. And pollinators are extremely important for the functioning of Earth's ecosystems and also extremely important for agriculture. And among all the wonderful pollinators that are found in the world, bees are arguably the most important pollinators in the world. And I can put it very simply, if you love food, then you should love bees and you should be thanking bees. So it's been estimated that every third bite of food you eat was pollinated by bees. If bees ceased to exist, you wouldn't starve, but your diet would probably not be very nutritious and not be very diverse or interesting either. It is also estimated that 75% of crops depend on insect pollination, and about 96% of crops, including some soybeans, will actually increase their yields with bee pollination. So they're really critical to our food system. And it's been estimated that there's been a 300% increase in the proportion of crops that depend on bee pollination since the mid-20th century. So we need bees more today than we ever have before. And to support the growth of the human population, we also need to sustain our bee populations. So when we're talking about bees, what I'd like to do is just describe what we're talking about. So honeybees, of course, many people are familiar with, and they're the main managed pollinator responsible for honey production and a lot of our pollination. But I'll talk equally today about non-honeybees, that is wild bees. And a lot of research is now showing that wild bees are just as important as honeybees for the pollination of crops, and certainly for the pollination of wild plants and some rare and important native species of plants as well. So there are bees, and then there are bees with a capital B. So everyone is familiar with the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera, that's been called humanity's best friend among the insects. These bees were brought over to the United States by colonists, so they are non-native to the United States. If you see a honeybee flying around in Iowa, chances are it is owned by someone. So most of the bees that you see flying around that are honeybees are not wild, they are actually managed. These bees are very important, of course, for honey production and also for pollination services of many crops. And so beekeeping, of course, is a form of agriculture, but sometimes folks I hear get confused when we say save the bees, don't hear save the honeybees. But what is true, and I'll be talking about a little bit today, is that the beekeepers need help too. So perhaps save the beekeepers might be a more apt description of where we should be thinking about beekeeping and our efforts towards improving honeybee health. Now, wild bees are very abundant and diverse. So there are many species of native bees in the world. In Iowa alone, we have perhaps close to 300 different species. These are not managed by humans, but they're extremely important for crop pollination and also pollination of many native plants. So when you hear Save the Bees, what I hope you do hear is a message of wildlife conservation. And so a lot of these bees are in decline and really need our help. So despite the fact that we rely on these insects for our food production and for the maintenance of our natural ecosystems, bees are in trouble. And so bee declines are a global problem. Worldwide, many of the world's 20,000 or so bee species are already in decline. So for example, the rusty-patched bumblebee is an endangered species found right here in Iowa. Some estimates suggest that 40% of all wild bee species are in decline. So it's reaching the point where most bee species are in need of attention from a conservation perspective. Beekeeping is also struggling. So beekeepers are experiencing unsustainable colony losses, with US losses averaging 30% annually. So across the US, 30% of honeybees are dying every year. And so this is a bad situation for bees at a time when we humans need them more than we ever have. So one of the contributors, sadly and unfortunately, to these declines that research is certainly pointing towards is human activity. And human activity has really changed the world, not just for lots of different species, including our own selves, but of course for pollinators. So whereas habitat may have been diverse and abundant with floral resources in the past, today these habitats have been replaced by human habitats, such as animal pastures, urban lands, and of course, large-scale agriculture. So today, what I'm actually going to focus on is what's really relevant to us here in Iowa is large-scale agriculture and the impact that, that this is having on our bees. So across the United States, this is a map from the USDA showing the percent of land in cultivation, and the greener it is, the more percent of land is under crop cultivation. So the very dark green here is 90% or more of that land cover is in crops, and here is Iowa. Iowa is estimated to be about 86% under cultivation. So we're a land that is pretty extreme. From the air, you have probably seen this flying in a plane. This is what Iowa looks like. Some people call this flyover country. So if you're a bee, you might also call it flyover country. A bee flying through this landscape looking for nesting habitat or looking for a place to find some flowers. There's really not a whole lot out there on the landscape in Iowa. I think Iowa's also particularly interesting in studying how these changes in the landscape can influence pollinators. In a way, it sort of represents a possible landscape of the future. And so if we look at Iowa's land cover, pre-colonization times, about 80% of Iowa was in native tallgrass prairie, as shown in red here in the state of Iowa. But now less than 0.1% of the land cover is in this native prairie, whereas over 80% is in farmland, and the vast majority of that is in monocultures of corn and soybeans, of course. So this has been an absolutely drastic change for wildlife and a drastic change for bees. So whereas historically the landscape would have looked something like this, which has a high diversity and abundance of flowers throughout the entire growing season, today, most of the landscape looks a lot more like this, which is a very low diversity landscape in terms of flowers. Soybeans are, of course, one of the dominant species on this landscape, and they do produce nectar that is foraged on actively by bees, but this is for a very short period of time, only about 1 month of the year. Corn is the other dominant plant, of course, on our landscape, and it does produce pollen, corn being wind pollinated. However, it's of poor nutritional value for pollinators, and it's really not favored by bees at all. So this is a landscape that's not providing the same kind of diversity, the same kind of seasonality in the availability of forage for bees. So that's the place, but what's actually going on with bees in this landscape? Well, I'm sorry to not have very good news for you there either. And so some people have called the upper Midwest ground zero for bee losses. And I think there's actually some data that kind of support that supposition. So this is a graph showing total colony losses across the United States in 2020 to 2021. And the darker orange in this graph shows the higher the colony losses by beekeepers. And we had a 77% annual colony loss in 2020 to 2021 in Iowa. We are number one, actually, last year in terms of colony losses across the United States. When it comes to wild bees, this is a paper that came out a few years ago looking at the abundance of wild bees across the United States. In this graph, we have a different color scheme. So more yellow indicates a lower abundance and more declining species of bees. And Iowa here is basically pure yellow. So we see a state here that is also suffering in terms of having problems with the wild bee populations, very low bee abundance in Iowa as well. So of course, we're asking ourselves why, what's going on here, what's causing these declines in both wild bee populations and these massive losses in honeybee colonies. Well, there are multiple stresses here that are interacting with each other. It's not a simple problem, unfortunately. So we know that parasites and pathogens are a huge problem, especially with beekeeping. The varroa mites are a big issue. And then they can actually exchange diseases with wild bees. We also know that pesticide use is very heavy, especially in the upper Midwest, and that this certainly can contribute to health problems for pollinators. But we also know that there just isn't a lot out there for bees to forage on. And so if they're not having good nutrition, this can lead to eroded health and make them more susceptible to all kinds of other stresses. So really, it's this multifactorial interacting problem of so many different stresses coming together. So that's a pretty bleak picture. And there is some evidence from Iowa here for poor foraging resources, and that's actually going to be the focus of my talk today. I have worked on parasites and pathogens and pesticides, but I'm not really going to focus on that today, but happy to answer any questions about that after my talk. So today, what I want to focus on is the landscape and the habitat in our landscape here in Iowa and how that really does matter for bees. So today I'm going to summarize a lot of work that has been going on over the past almost decade or so, as well as talking about some of the newer work that we're doing currently. And I'd like to just thank all the collaborators I've worked with on this project over the years, and especially highlighting Dr. Matt O'Neill in the entomology department here at Iowa State, and then Adam Dolezal, who was a former postdoc in the lab, who's now a professor in Illinois, and then two former PhD students, Ashley St. Clair and Ge Zhang, who did a lot of this work that I'm going to be talking about today. This has been a big team effort. So we have this bee team at Iowa State, and we've been working together collaboratively for several years now. And I'm going to give you some highlights into what we've been finding. So first of all, we've been looking at the landscape around where bees live. And there are effects within Iowa. So you can find areas in Iowa that are less under farming, less agricultural, and then those that are more agricultural. So we actually did a landscape analysis and divided areas into high ag and low ag, looking directly around where bees were being found in a 1 mile radius. And what we found is that areas of high ag are associated with lower abundance and species richness of wild bees. We found that high ag is also associated with honeybees that have lower fat stores going into winter. So just like a bear, they need to store lots of fat and use that to survive through the winter, and they're not storing enough fat. And then finally, we found that Iowa honeybee colonies seem to experience a feast-famine dynamic where they grow a lot in the mid-season, but then at the end of the season, they really crash and burn in the Iowa landscape. So interestingly, Ashley St. Clair, grad student in the lab, identified this problem as part of her PhD work and wanted to do something about it. So we had colonies that were located adjacent to soybean fields, and right before that crash was going to happen, Ashley transported them into restored prairie habitats. and actually found that this crash is not inevitable. So if you take colonies out of these highly agricultural landscapes and you put them right into a restored prairie habitat, you actually can rescue them from this late season crash. And they actually, instead of losing so much weight, they actually can rebound in their weight at a critical time in the season, right before they're going into winter, which is actually when they experience most of the losses that we see of these colonies. So this gave us this hopeful message that this loss is not inevitable, and perhaps through selecting habitat where we put our bees in the Iowa landscape, we can actually potentially try to change this situation. So this led to our question, can we implement a solution in the Iowa landscape that can work for both farmers, beekeepers, and bees, both wild bees and managed honeybees? So that's where I'm going to switch over and talk about some of our unpublished current work that's ongoing. And this is related to prairie strips. So prairie strips, a lot of you may be familiar with this, but just in case you're not, I direct you to these resources. So this is the Prairie Strips website at Iowa State. So prairie strips is a conservation practice in the Conservation Reserve Program. This practice has been studied for over a decade by a lot of folks at Iowa State. And I'm a relatively recent person joining into this research. So what I'd like to do is just start off by summarizing some of the work that's gone on prairie strips previously that's not related to bees. So prairie strips essentially is when 10%, at least 10% of a crop field, either corn or soybean field, is taken out of crop production, and restored prairie is established there through seeding of prairie plants. And this has shown a lot of benefits for soil erosion, soil nutrient retention, and then also wildlife conservation. And also along with this, of course, you're putting in a higher diversity of plants, and you're getting more abundance of flowers on the landscape that are blooming throughout the season. So this presents a really interesting opportunity to ask, well, what about bees in these landscapes? Are there also benefits to bees in these prairie strip habitats? So I'd like to talk about some of the research on prairie strips, some of the latest stuff we've been doing. So this is some work by a couple of graduate students, Ge Zhang, who is already received his PhD and is now a postdoc at Washington State University, and Kate Borchardt, who is a current graduate student. So the first question here is, do prairie strips provide health benefits to managed honeybee colonies? So Ge Zhang did this work, and what he did was actually place a small apiary, so a group of 4 honeybee colonies, into prairie strips. And then he looked at how they performed in these prairie strips compared to honeybee colonies that had been placed on field edges of corn or soybean fields that did not have any prairie strips. So he looked at this over the course of a couple of years, and what he found is that prairie strips colonies really thrived. So here are just some graphs showing colony weight and adult bee population, and this was tracked over the course of the entire growing season from June through October. And here in blue, you can see the prairie strips are outperforming the controls in terms of colony growth, and then they just stay larger at the end of the season, which is really important for going into winter. They need enough honey to survive. If we look at the actual bee populations in these colonies, Ge also found an increase in bee populations in prairie strips over controls, and that this was maintained throughout the season. He also was interested in asking whether these prairie strips colonies survive better. So he tracked their survival after they had lived in prairie strips over the course of the following winter, over the course of 2 years. And here what you're looking at are survival curves of these colonies. So 100% survival at the beginning, and then how many of them actually made it through the winter. This is 2 different winters. We had 2018-19, which was a really harsh winter, 2019-2020, which was a less severe winter. We saw similar patterns in both years, but actually the data were only significant in 2020. So what he found is increased survival of colonies in prairie strips in blue over the controls. And then when he looked at how many actual adult bees survived the winter. He found larger clusters of adult bees after the winter in the prairie strips colonies compared to the controls. So he also wanted to know, well, why is this? Does it have something to do with having better access to forage, to pollen and nectar resources? So he actually put on pollen traps, which is something you put on the front of your colonies and knock the pollen off the bees for a day and see what they're bringing in. And he did this several times throughout the course of the season and found that indeed bee colonies in prairie strips were collecting more pollen than controls. Primarily, this was legume pollen. So clover was a dominant species, which is an exotic. However, even some native species were in there, such as partridge pea, suggesting that the bees are probably utilizing both field edges and prairie strips for their forage, and that overall prairie strips are helping the bees gain access to better forage. So yes, to answer our question, do prairie strips provide health benefits? Yeah, we see larger and heavier colonies. We see improved overwintering success, at least in some years, and we see that they're bringing in more abundant pollen forage. So this is good news for beekeepers in terms of benefits that they might experience if they place their colonies into these prairie strips. However, honeybees are only part of the story. And so we also want to support our wild bee populations. And of course, this is restored native habitat. And so we would like to bring back the native bees as well in looking at these prairie strips. So do prairie strips provide benefits to wild bees and their interactions with native plants in these prairie strips? So previous work by Matt O'Neill and several others who looked at prairie strips in wild bees found increased abundance of wild bees in prairie strips compared to control crop field farms. But what we wanted to do is actually look at their interactions with plants on these prairie strips. So if they're interacting more with plants, this is good news because that suggests not only are the bees benefiting, but the whole community of plants and bees that interdepend on each other can potentially show benefits. So Kate Borchardt, our current grad student in the lab, observed plant-bee interactions at paired prairie strip and control sites. She looked at bees that were touching the reproductive regions of a flower and recorded the species identifications of both the bees and the flowers. And then she also photographed the bees' wings because that tells us how hard they've been having to work for their food. So these are some network diagrams that Kate put together from her results. So here you see 5 pairs of sites, control and strip sites. And the bees, imagine each one of these little blocks on the top is a bee species, and each one of the little blocks on the bottom is a plant species, and all the potential interactions between them. The thicker the line, the more observations that we saw of that particular interaction. And so what you can immediately see is that the strip sites on average had more interactions than the control sites. But what she can actually do is get more quantitative with this and can actually analyze the nature of those interactions. And so by running some statistical analyses on these networks, we can actually look at the nature of these interactions. And that's what Kate has done. So here are some data showing a couple of different network indicators that she looked at. The first is links per species, and this tells us how many interacting partners each plant had with each bee and vice versa. And so here, more links per species is good because that would be associated with an increased probability that a plant is actually going to get successfully pollinated. And what she found here is that prairie strips had more links per species compared to controls. The next thing she looked at is nestedness. This one's a little bit harder to wrap your brain around, but the idea here is that the structure of the network, if it has a more nested structure, that tells you that what we have is a core of generalist species that are interacting with a lot of other species that are always going to be there and really robust. And the fact that they're there, that allows rare species to have support at the ecological level. So for example, like a plant that they rely on is probably always going to be there because there are other generalist bees that are interacting with it as well. So what she found is that the nestedness of these networks is actually higher in prairie strips compared to controls, suggesting again that there is more robust or even improved interaction structures among bees in prairie strips compared to these control sites. The other thing that Kate looked at was the wings. And so I told you that you can look at bees' wings and actually look at, the wings tell a story in a sense. So if the bees have low wing wear, that is, they're really intact wings, that tells you that they've had to fly fewer miles in order to get their foraging resources. And if the wings are really tattered and beat up, that tells you that they've flown more miles. And so by pooling all the bee species that she collected together and looking at averages, she found that on average, bees collected in prairie strips had more intact wings than those in controls. And this suggests that they have to expend less effort for their foraging resources when they're out there in the prairie strips compared to the controls. So to answer this question, do prairie strips provide benefits to wild bees and plant bee ecological interactions? It looks like they do. So we see more complex bee-plant interactions in strips compared to controls. These network indicators suggest a more robust and stable set of ecological interactions among bees and plants, and possibly lower foraging effort. However, this did vary by species. So what's next? So I don't have any more results to share with you today, but I just wanted to let you know that this work is ongoing. And one of the really big things that we think is important moving forward is to look at not just bee-plant interactions, but interactions between wild bees and honeybees. And so again, this is kind of where agriculture meets conservation. Honeybees are non-native, and there's substantial evidence that honeybees actually may negatively impact wild bees. So this can happen through disease transmission, competition for limited foraging resources. And so the question is, can honeybees and wild bees coexist? And I think prairie strips are actually a great analogy for this coexistence idea. So in prairie strips, we have agriculture and we have a conservation practice that sustains wildlife actually coexisting in the landscape. So can actually prairie strips also support the coexistence of honeybee keeping, a form of agriculture, and the conservation of wild bees? So this is something that we're currently looking at, and this is the work of Kate Borchardt. And we're asking, can beekeeping and wild bee conservation efforts coexist on strips? So we have some promising previous results from the work of Ashley St. Clair, who found no effect of managed honeybees on wild bee community composition in the context of Iowa soybean fields. However, we need to do more work on this because that was not on prairie strips, where the goal is simultaneous agricultural production and wildlife conservation. And that was also with a fairly small number of honeybee colonies that actually wouldn't be really at the level that a commercial beekeeper would be interested in. So this past year, we did an experiment just to add bees. So the idea here was that we looked at prairie strip sites that either had honeybee apiaries of 20 colonies installed or not, and compared what happened to the wild bee plant interactions and wild bee health indicators at prairie strip sites that had honeybee apiaries or not. So this is some ongoing work by Kate. And we also have a group of undergraduates, which we are calling the Bee Squad, which started last year. It's a new undergraduate internship program, which will continue in 2022. And we're continuing to process these data. So stay tuned for the latest results. With that, I would really like to thank our funding sources that over the past many years that have gone into this research. And especially the members of the ISUB team that contributed to this work that I've mentioned today, in addition to a lot of other collaborators who we've worked with on this project and a large group of undergraduates. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And I'm also going to put up a couple of the slides here that were requested for some of the programs for the Iowa Learning Farms. Thank you.
All right. Great, Dr. Toth, and we do have some questions. Feel free to type in some others. For those that are watching for a Certified Crop Advisor CEU credit, please email Liz Ripley, ejucums@iastate.edu by today at 5 o'clock with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. So please do that. I bet Liz will put that in the chat box. One item before I forget, in the chat box, Liz also put the link to a virtual field day on this topic as well. So feel free to go and watch that. And maybe you can bring up the last slide.
Sure.
Just before we get to questions, that next week we have Dr. Adam Janke and Casey Waters to talk about the Iowa Master Conservationist Program, Planting Seeds of Conservation. So be sure to tune in next Wednesday at noon. Okay, let's get to the questions. So the first question was, you didn't mention management of bees as a stressor. Do you think Langstroth's equipment is sufficient in colder climates?
Okay, yeah. So just to explain to the group what the question is, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not seeing that question in the
Okay.
chat. I don't know if I'm
They just came to me, not to bother you.
Oh,
So
okay,
was,
just came to you. Okay. So whether the beekeeping management matters.
Okay.
I think there are many aspects of beekeeping management, and I think the question was specifically asking about so the most commonly used beekeeping equipment is the movable frame hive invented by Lorenzo Langstroth back in the 1800s, and it hasn't really changed much since. And so some people have thought, why don't we try different hive designs, and there could be something that could work better for bees than the Langstroth hive. So it's kind of a bee management question. And so I think there are many different aspects of bee management that make a huge difference. And so today what we're doing is talking about a lot of averages across many different, like the data that I showed at the very beginning, averages across states, for example. If you actually start to break that down by management type, you see huge effects. And so, for example, commercial beekeepers experience a lot lower losses than hobby beekeepers, for example. So experience matters. There are many other aspects of beekeeping that might matter depending on region as well. So different strains or subspecies of bees or races of bees that people use can make a difference. And perhaps even hive design. So I don't know a lot of people that do not use Langstroth hives. So I don't think there's a lot of good data on that I could point to say yes or no, whether there could be improvements on using other hive designs. But certainly I think management matters a huge amount. In terms of our own studies, just to be clear, we managed all those hives ourselves. And so we controlled for management. So we use kind of standard beekeeping practices most of the time, although we had a little bit of a live and let die strategy, as you might have seen for the overwintering. Like we kind of wanted to see what happened when they experienced the Iowa winter and not baby them too much to buffer those effects. So we actually, that one year we saw really high losses. So we didn't necessarily do a lot of supplementary feeding, for example, because that was one of the things that we wanted to see if the landscape could provide them with the food that they needed. So yeah, I think there's a lot in that question in terms of like beekeeping management, and I could probably go on about it. So I hope that kind of started to answer your question a little bit.
Great. Next one is, anyone compared prairie strips to a single block of prairie within a crop landscape, keeping the percent of the field in the prairie the same?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. Not directly. And that's something that we are interested in. Indirectly, however, we have some data on that. So when I say not directly, we haven't had a study where we put out hives simultaneously at a prairie strip or at like a restored prairie, let's say that was larger, and compare that to a crop field all at the same time. But we have done restored prairies that are larger than prairie strips. For example, we did a study where we looked, and this is the work of Gajang again, looking at larger tracts of restored prairie in the Chachaco Bottoms Greenbelt, and looked at hive growth and some of the same metrics that we looked at with the prairie strips. And so anecdotally, I can't show you like direct statistics, but anecdotally, actually, the prairie strips colonies do the very best of any of them. And so the ones in the restored prairies we thought would do better than the prairie strips, but they actually did not. And so one of the interesting questions moving forward is why? I mean, is that really true? And if so, why? And one idea that we had about that is that actually the soybean bloom in the middle of the season is really important for honeybees to collect nectar, huge amounts of nectar. And so they grow a ton during soybean bloom. And so actually being near a soybean field could actually be good for honeybees. The problem is when that bloom ends, they kind of crash and burn. And so having access to both prairie and access to soybean nectar, we think might be in some ways like a sweet spot, kind of optimal for honeybees. But that's something that it's just sort of an idea right now. We don't have hard data on that. So that's one of the questions that we'd like to look at more moving forward.
Yeah, and actually the next question kind of fits in with that. Has there been any research into the timing of flowering and bee survival? The thought was by this individual. The thought was that we do not have enough fall blooming plants in many landscapes, and this is leading to bee loss.
Definitely. Yep. So I didn't have time to talk about it, but it's all about timing. It is all about timing. So that's one of the main messages that we're getting from these data too. It's almost like we talked about this feast famine dynamic that we're seeing in the landscape. And actually, July is a great time to be a bee in Iowa. You've got lots of clover, you've got lots of soybean nectar everywhere. And then there are quite a few wildflowers blooming. The problem is the late season, as you identified, is a real problem. And after soybean ceases to bloom, that's also when clover shuts down, which is hugely important for bees. And there aren't a lot of other exotics that are staying in bloom really late. On the other hand, we see a lot of prairie plants, like, for example, goldenrod is just huge for pollinators in the late season. And so it seems like the late season is a time where if there is not access to uncultivated land, the bees really are just finding very little to forage on out in the landscape. And so timing seems to be critically important. So it's not necessarily that there aren't enough flowers total in the Iowa landscape. It's the timing of those is too concentrated into a short period of time, and it's not sustaining them across the season. So one of the things about prairie habitat is, especially in that late season, you see a lot more late blooming species, providing a wider variety and abundance of floral resources that are going to sustain bees when they most need it.
This kind of gets at maybe some of the work you're looking to start, but kind of a question: do we need to understand the impact of honeybees on the wild bees before we encourage the establishment of those honeybee colonies near the prairie strips?
Yeah, super important question. I think so, but it depends on what you want to get out of your prairie strips. And so, that really comes down to the individual. And if you want honey and you want, that's a main priority for you, and you're not as worried about the wild bees, then it looks from our data like honeybees are going to do really well on those prairie strips and produce a lot of honey for you. On the other hand, if your goal is to simultaneously support wildlife conservation, including wild bees, and really the plants that depend on those wild bees for pollination, then I think it's really important to know the impact of the honeybees on the wild bees before we go recommending that practice widely. From the broader perspective of really, again, this coexistence idea of, can we simultaneously have efficiently produce agriculture as well as sustain populations of wildlife and wild flora. So yeah, in my book, that's a really, really important question. And I'm personally not going to recommend it widely until we know a little bit more about that question, because my personal goal is actually both of those things.
Oh, great. There were a couple questions in there about if there are any federal programs to help with prairie strips, and there are. It's a cost shareable practice, and I think this person was in Michigan, and actually I have a sticker about Michigan strips. So there's some work going on at the Kellogg Biological Station on this. So I think that's great. Okay, there was question couple in here about thinking about how this in the prairie strips, and maybe this isn't in your area as much, but thinking about that we have a lot of co-ops out there spraying these areas, and how do we ensure that we're making sure that we're that's taken into account and maybe factored in as we think about the management of these areas and the impact on bees.
I'm going to put in a plug for Driftwatch here. So if folks have not heard of Driftwatch, so beekeepers can and should register their beehives on Driftwatch. And so this is a program that will provide the location of active beehives. And so when growers go to spray, they should check first and see if there are bees in the area. In spraying, you should always follow the bee rule and spray, only at certain times of day and under certain wind conditions, and let your beekeeper know as well. So local beekeepers can be contacted And then beekeepers will sometimes close up their hives, for example, during spraying. And so increased communication can help a lot with that problem. And so I didn't talk a lot about pesticides today, but there is some evidence that in prairie strips that bees can be exposed to insecticides. And so that is something that we should be concerned about and should be thinking about in these habitats.
Has there been any work looking at the impact of different alternative seed species mixes in strips or in prairie areas to help with bees?
Yeah, that's been a huge area of research in the bee conservation community. But in terms of prairie strips, no, we haven't actually varied the seed mix. We've been just kind of working with what people have. So a lot of times, so we're working with farmer cooperators here in a lot of cases, and these are already established prairie strips. So it's not like we designed them with pollinators in mind necessarily. So actually, I think there might be even room for improvement if, especially if pollinator conservation is a goal. There has been a lot of interest in different seed mixes and looking at what types of prairie communities attract the most pollinators. And so that's something that that I think deserves a lot more attention moving forward. And there actually is quite a bit of good research out there about particular forage species that are highly attractive to different pollinators or to a wide diversity of pollinators. And so I think that's a really exciting thing to think about in terms of prairie strips moving forward, especially as we're gaining more and more information about the potential benefits to bees and other pollinators.
Okay, we got another question here, and I'm gonna show my inability or not knowing the right terms, but did your experiments supplement, feed, and treat for Varroa, V-A-R-R-O-A?
We did treat for Varroa. So the Varroa destructor mites, if you don't treat for Varroa, you have dead hives. And so we did treat for Varroa kind of prophylactically. I talked about a lot of different experiments today, and they were slightly different, but in general, we would treat multiple times per year prophylactically. And we also monitored mite levels and kept track of those so that we could see if there were mite effects on our colonies. So we usually were able to keep mites in check, I'll say, not like zero, but in check. And then as far as supplemental feeding, we did not supplemental feed. And that is something that distinguishes what we did from what a beekeeper would do. And so beekeepers, of course, supplemental feed, especially in spring and in fall. And we did supplemental feed in the spring to get the colonies to build up before putting them out, but not in fall, because that was actually one of the areas of interest, was whether the landscape could support the bees' nutritional health and forage needs. So we did not supplemental feed in the fall. So a lot of the declines that we saw, a beekeeper could go in and take action through supplemental feeding. But I think an interesting question moving forward is, if you have the right landscape, do you have to do that? Or do you have to do as much of that? Because if you place your bees in a place where the land can provide that forage that they need at that critical time late in the season, then supplemental feeding may be less necessary under some circumstances. So that's one of the things that, yeah, we did, like I said, we did a little bit of live and let die there to kind of see the effect of the landscape on the outcomes of those beehives.
All right. Again, Liz Ripley put in there where to send if you need a CCA credit. We're going to go to the last question, respecting Dr. Toth's time. But so the last one is thinking about the diversity or the importance of bee species diversity, and that, if we ended up with non-native honeybees, does that impact our environment in detrimental ways? So does the diversity of wild and domesticated bees, is that important?
Yeah, it definitely is important. And so as we know, the number of bee species is declining and their abundance is declining, and Iowa is one of the places that is in the need of most help. So it's been identified as a critical area for bee conservation. There's a lot of improvement that could happen in that area. So adding honeybees into that mix, that could be yet another stressor in the environment that could negatively impact wild bees. We do have some hopeful data coming out suggesting that there's not large effects of honeybees on wild bee communities in the context of soybean fields. So these perhaps are already disturbed habitats, and the wild bee species that are the most resilient to stress are still there, and you add honeybees and they don't seem to suffer too much from that. But we don't have a lot of good information on what might be going on in the context of prairie strips yet. That's kind of what we're doing right now. So we don't have clear information on that. So again, it's this balance of what are you trying to maximize, or are you trying to find some kind of optimal solution to both agricultural production and beekeeping being a part of that, and wildlife conservation. And I think we're trying to figure out what the sweet spot is there, I guess, in terms of supporting all of these goals from our land, and our pollinators being an important part of that. So yeah, I'd say stay tuned, maybe proceed with caution with your honeybees at this point in time. They're certainly an important part of our livelihood and our agricultural system. But there's growing evidence that wild bees are as important in the same way, not for honey production, but for pollination services. So we might be doing ourselves a disservice by focusing only on honeybees.
Great. I think that's a good place to end it. I know there are a couple other questions, but in the interest of time, I think, thank you, Dr. Toth. That was really informative. And again, tune in next week for Adam and Casey talking about the Master Conservationist Program. With that, thanks everybody for attending this webinar. I hope you have a great day and stay warm out there.